This is Kathy Nastrom interviewing Annie L. McPheeters for the Georgia Government Documentation Project and the Southern Oral History Program. Today is June 8, 1992. I'd like to begin, if you don't mind, having you talk about how you came to be a librarian, your choice of a career.
First of all, I'd like to give credit to my mother. My mother was an avid reader, and as a child, she always loved to read to me, and she taught me how to read even before I entered public school. And each birthday and Christmas time, she always gave me a book for my presents. And so I became interested in books and reading at a very early age. And then as I grew older, I knew that I would want one day to work with people and books and to bring them together. For as Anne Osborne, said in one of her writings, it's not enough to love books. You got to love people too. And this was a motto of mine. I wanted to bring books and people together. And after going to college, I started working as a student librarian, and then later I went to library school. And after completing my work as a professional librarian, I began working in the public library. The public library service was my main interest in library service. And as has been recorded, the public library is one with the public school in that it teaches people how to know how to read, provide them with books and materials, and last of all, the public library works with people in their various efforts in learning how to become good citizens. And this, of course, was one of the main purposes of our public library. And in addition to that type of service, the whole community, as a result, would be better educated if they became members of the public library. And this was one of the things that we, in our attempts in the public library, did to bring citizens into close contact with the public library. So that down through the years, we did various, our staff was organized so that we could bring the citizen and his library into close contact. And on our staff, we had, they were organized, and in fact, as I was the librarian, head of the library, and head of the Negro department, I organized the staff in this manner. I, as a head librarian, would be in charge of the adult education programs and do the outreach programs. Then the children's librarian would work with the children and the young people. And then we had another non-professional who did the clerical work and who did the publicity for our branch. And then we had a library page who came in and served, selected, slipped and shared the books and placed those books on the shelves. I want to back up and say this, that I fashioned this program for our branches in connection with the adult education program, which had been started many years ago in the New York Public Library. The American Library Association, the Association for Adult Education, and the Carnegie Library had a program for adult education. They set up two projects. One project was set up in the 135th Street branch of the New York Public Library, and the other project was set up at the Auburn Branch Library, which was a part of the Carnegie Corporation. And so, as a result of this project, I learned a good bit on how to set up an adult education program at our library, and was through this type of connection which I had learned as a result of that program how to function in and work with the various groups in our community.
The adult education program that you just described, if I'm remembering right, that was conducted largely in the 1930s. Is that correct?
Yes, that project started at the Auburn branch in 1931, and it lasted from 1931 to 1934.
Mm-hmm.
And its purpose was to uh, reach and contact various groups and persons in the community, and they would come into the library and listen to various discussions which the program had on, for its listeners. And this program was an excellent program for those persons who participated in it. As I said, various persons from the community were brought in to speak to the groups. We had the college presidents who came in, a president from Atlanta University, and several others. And at that time, also, one of the outstanding discussion groups centered around Gandhi and his movement. And we had several programs directly connected with the Gandhi movement. And then there were other aspects that were discussed too during this adult education program. So it lasted from 1931 to 1934. It was in 1934 that I came to the library, and just before that adult education project closed.
Mm-hmm.
And I was able to learn a good bit about how an adult education project would function. And when that project closed, then I was able to work out an adult education program for our library. And although we did not have the staff to carry out the project as much as it had been done under the adult education program, but we did follow through as much as we could in that respect.
I know that just before the time that you came to be the librarian at the Auburn branch would have been the time that people such as John Wesley Dobbs were founding the Atlanta Civic and Political League.
Yes.
Do you know if the library had any part in that, or if some political discussions took place in the library related to that kind of early effort to organize blacks politically in the city?
Mr. Dobbs was one of our outstanding citizens, as you know, and he was constantly in the library. He was very interested in the library, and at that time his office was directly across the street from the Auburn Branch Library, and he frequently came into the library to discuss his interest in civic and political affairs. And although most of the affairs of a political nature were not held in the library, we served those citizens, though, with materials which they would require. And in that way, we kept in direct contact with the civic and political leagues. And during these years, there were later years rather, there was formed a Negro Voters League, and that league, we worked with those voters leagues in many ways. Oftentimes they would need material for on candidates or whatever, and we furnished them with that material. I remember Warren Cochran, who was at the YWCA, YMCA. He came to oftentimes he said he couldn't get along without the library, how much it meant to him, and that oftentimes when he would ask for material, we would even give him more material than he could use. Reverend William Holmes Borders, who also was an outstanding minister, um, frequently worked with the political groups, and he would come in and we would furnish material with for his organizations also, and for the church members. What I'm trying to say is that all of the political groups that we had in our city, many of them, of course, use the library, not so much as reading rooms, but for various types of information. And this gave us an opportunity to do an outreach program too, as librarians. And we visited these programs whenever they would hold a program in the church or wherever. We went to these programs. We became a part and parcel of those programs too. And Mr. Baycoat, Dr. Baycoat, I should call him, who was at Atlanta University, was an outstanding person in the field of political science and activities. And his dissertation, most of it was done at our West Hunter branch. He wanted to use the newspapers to get material for his dissertation, and he would come to the library, and we would furnish him the materials for his use for his dissertation. Dr. Nelson was also a professor at Clark College, and he was doing his dissertation in some phase of politics. I believe it was on the 14th Amendment and black voters, and he came to the library for this type of material. What I'm saying is that we did so much work with persons in the various voters leagues and in the various civic and political leagues.
So the library was a research base as well as an outreach
That's
base.
right.
When you would go to these voters league meetings, would you take materials with you, or what would your role be at those meetings?
Sometimes I would take material. It all depended on the type of program that they were having. Sometimes I would take materials and pass it out, or I would we would make book lists and give these book lists, pass these book lists out, letting them know that certain types of material was in the library that they could use. And so that oftentimes, if there was no need for that type of material, when questions were asked, I would answer those questions, and usually I would point out that if you need further information, you can always find it at the library. But one of my main objectives, and the main objectives of our staff, was to be present at these meetings to show we were doing an outreach program, and we wanted to get as many people into the library as possible, and to let them know that the library was one of their institutions which they could depend on. It was a tool to fight ignorance. The library was set up for that purpose, and we wanted them to know that.
Did you get very many people following up on that offer of assistance? You mentioned Dr. Baycode and Reverend Borders coming in. Was it a regular thing that you had people coming in asking for assistance?
Yes, as a result of these this outreach program of ours, we educated a lot of people as to what they could find in the library and what help they could get from us. And sometimes not only did they get material for their interest in their various voters leagues, clubs, sometimes there were other materials in other areas which they knew that they could find in the library. There were some other groups that served well in this aspect too. And I would like to mention, if it's convenient, if you feel it's necessary at this time, I would like to say something about our work with the various women who participated in the politics
Right.
of
Please.
our services in our community. One of the first groups that I knew about and had worked with was the Negro Women's Voters League. This league, as I understand it, was formed by Mrs. Ruby Blackburn. Mrs. Blackburn was an outstanding person, a very active person in the community, and she was most interested in voters and voting, and she knew of the lack of interest on the part of black voters to turn out and vote. And one of her main objectives was to go into the various meetings, and in anywhere in the community that she had a chance, she was always interested in talking with those groups and encouraging them to vote and to participate in the various voters leagues. And as a result, as I said, she formed what she was known as the Negro Women's Voters League. That league was Negro Women Voters Voters League. Yeah, she called it. It was organized, I think, around late 1947 or 49. And although she was an uneducated woman, she had her work basically for a livelihood. She was a beautician, but she was so interested in politics and civic activities that she went all over the city and even out of the city. She went to Washington and other places like that, carrying the message and interesting people in their right to vote and their right to participate in voting activities. And the other group that our library staff worked closely with was the League of Women Voters. This group of women were very instrumental. Each year when that time came, they would collect a lot of material on the various persons running for office, and they would distribute this material to the various libraries. Well, it was a long time before we knew in the library much about the League of Women Voters, because at that time segregation was still an outstanding aspect in our community. And we did learn later about the League of Women Voters and their activity, and I contacted them, and they would come to the library and give us materials for use to pass out to the various citizens. One of the things that they were instrumental in doing, as well as the Negro Women Voters League, was to assist citizens in learning how to use the voting machines. During those early years, after we stopped casting our ballots, just marking a ballot and dropping it in the box, then the voting machines became popular. But the citizens, many of them, stayed away and were afraid to use them. And as a result, they did not know how to use these voting machines. And so the League of Women Voters and the Negro Women Voters League would come to the library and teach the citizens how to use these machines, because we had asked that the voting machines be placed in all of the branches, and they were also placed at the main library. And so we were able to teach many citizens how to use those voting machines. Now, one of our little branches, the University Homes branch, which was located in the University Homes housing project, served for many, many years as a voting place, precinct. Our citizens would go there and register to vote, and I have a beautiful picture in my file on those citizens being registered to vote there in the University Homes housing project. The University Homes housing project, as you know, was the first government housing project set up for blacks in Atlanta.
And was the voting and voter registration done in the actually in the small library that was at University Homes?
Yes, it was done there.
Right.
Yes.
This training to use the voting machines, I also have heard other references to that and seen photographs in the newspaper, and I believe, as well as the League of Women Voters and the Negro Women's Voters League, that some members from the Phyllis Wheatley Y were involved with that, and I think also the Atlanta chapter of the National Council of Negro Women.
Yes.
So it was very much a project that women coordinated.
That's true.
And I wondered if you had any recollection of why this particular aspect of voter education was run by women.
That's a good question. I had never thought of it before, but I venture to say that women were beginning to, at that time, women were beginning to know that it was important for them to get out of the home and do some of those, participate in some activities that meant so much to the total community, and one of them was this matter of voting for people in office who would mean so much to them and to their family and to the community at large. And many of those women, all of them were not housewives that participated in this program either. Many of them were women who were teachers and who were librarians and who were in other walks of life other than just in the home. But I think that women were beginning to feel the importance of getting out into the community and doing this type of thing and interesting citizens in doing getting people to the polls and getting citizens who were running for office, getting certain people in who would become interested in our affairs.
Right. I am interested also in the work of the Negro Women's Voters League, which I've seen it referred to that way, and I've seen it referred to as the League of Negro Women Voters. I think it went by both names at different times, or people called it different names. And a little bit before Ruby Blackburn established this league, the Atlanta Negro Voters League was established by people such as Dr. Baycoat. And I wondered if you had any sense of how Mrs. Blackburn would have worked with these other organizations and why she felt a need to establish a group for women.
I understand that there was an interest before in getting women into this activity of getting people to vote, but I don't know what that group, who they were, but I do know that Mrs. Blackburn was one of the more outstanding persons in the field. But I really, what, would you ask your question again?
Yeah, I
I,
kind of said it in a very roundabout way.
yes.
Um, it, I think basically I wondered if Mrs. Blackburn, by forming a women's group, was reaching out in a different way or to a different constituency than other voting groups were doing.
I have a feeling that she wasn't.
Mm-hmm.
I didn't know Mrs. Blackburn very well, but I have a feeling that all of them were going in the same
Mm-hmm.
direction, because at this time, the black citizens were beginning to know that if we were to make any advances in our lives and in our communities, that we were going to have to do something about it, because in early years we couldn't vote, or if we got to the polls, we were asked to go in a certain direction, and we would have to stand in line and wait. And then oftentimes the persons who were running for these different positions, I think there were no blacks at that time running for these positions. And so women and just knew that it was time for them to get in and work in this connection. And then you take men like Dr. Baycoat and Reverend Borders and Warren Cochran and several of the other ministers. They knew outstanding women in their field, and they encouraged women to participate in these activities too. And oftentimes in the churches, political groups would often meet in the churches, and these women would be there. And so this just it was one of these things that just
Kept going.
kept spiraling.
Right.
Yeah.
How would groups such as the Negro Voters League reach out to women? Do you recall the ways that they did that?
Well, I other than, as I say, oftentimes I remember definitely at the YMCA there was a program called the Hunger Club,
Right.
and this Hunger Club met each week, and various speakers were brought there to talk on different subjects. But during these years, interest was high in the politics of our city and getting people registered to vote. And I can remember oftentimes when Dr. Baycoat would be on program, this gave him an opportunity to reach out and talk to the various people in at that Hunger Club meeting. And most of the people at that time at the Hunger Club meetings were, about half of them were women.
Mm-hmm.
So, and Attorney Walden, I'm sorry, Attorney Walden, who was one of our outstanding black attorneys, he was a member of any number of groups where women were members, and those men would just naturally speak to the group, and they would encourage women to become part and parcel of such programs.
Another name that I've run across, actually, it was in reading the uh, the book that John Calhoun was writing in the late
Yes,
1980s. He mentioned something that he called the women's voluntary registration effort. And I don't know if that's the actual title of a group or his way of describing it, but he mentioned a Hallie Beecham Brooks. And I wondered if you recalled anything about her work in voter registration.
I knew Mrs. Brooks very well because she was a librarian at the Atlanta University Library School, and Mrs. Brooks uh, was one of the persons that I remember so very well, who would come to the library and help teach the people, citizens, how to use the to use those voting machines. Mrs. Brooks was like Mrs. Blackburn. She was a very dynamic person and a very dynamic speaker, and she carried a lot of weight in the community. Although she was working full time at the library, but she also did a lot of community work. And she, at one time, Mrs. Brooks was one of the women that was given not a citation, but at the Hunger Club, Mrs. Brooks, Mrs. William Holmes Borders, Mrs. Lucille Scott, and Mrs. Furlow, who was the principal of one of our public schools, um, and several other women were honored for their work in the Negro Women Voters League. So these women were outstanding in their work, and they were women who were capable of encouraging people. They had that know-how.
Had you finished the thought on that?
I wanted to say also the one other outstanding work that was done by the Negro Voters League was their interest not only in politics, but they were interested in the library, and they wanted to see that the library would be open to all citizens. That is the total library system. And they worked very closely with our friends of the library and several other groups, with the Atlanta Urban League and several other groups, to see that the library become desegregated,
Right.
so that they not only interested in their political activities, but they were interested in the library as a whole.
Right.
Yeah.
Before we get into that, I have one more question about the voter registration
Yeah.
effort. What we've been talking about so far has been mainly in the 1950s, the time when the Atlanta Negro Voters League was first very active. And I wondered if you recalled any voter registration work of the mid-1940s when you were at the Auburn branch, because I'm thinking that in the first months of 1946, there was a major voter registration effort in the black community here in Atlanta. Were you a part of that at all?
As I remember, I have, ever since I was in the library, beginning in 1934, I did become a part of the various voters leagues, working with them. I don't remember doing too much as far as other than what I have intimated that we did, so that I did work with them, as I have said. I kind of, when I first came to the library, I was interested in all the groups, and those men that I knew, I did work with them. I'm not sure that I have answered your question.
Right.
Uh,
The one other way to approach it might be to say that before the Atlanta Negroes Voters League was formed,
Oh, yeah.
it became permanent, but it was first started in 1946 for the voter registration effort then called the All Citizens Registration Committee.
Yeah.
And Dr. Baycoat, again, was one of the ones that started that. So do you have any recollection of that group's work in 1946?
Yes, briefly. I remember that Dr. Baycoat and Mr. Dobbs and several of the men who were participating in that group at that time, they were instrumental in getting people to the polls. And this was a big day for Atlanta at that time. They offered rides if people couldn't get to the polling place. They offered rides, and they would go and stand with us until we voted. And at that time, as I said, we oftentimes had to mark the ballot, and they would stand right there with us in case a person couldn't read. You had to read information, and if that person couldn't read well, they would read the information and interpret the information to them so that they could vote properly. And that was one of the big projects that this All Citizens group did, was to see that people got to the polls. And they got out a lot of information in the newspaper, in the Atlanta Daily World, telling people about the time to go vote, and that offer them rides, so that they were a very active group in that respect also.
And did the Auburn Library branch have any role in the work in 1946?
Yes, these are the things that we did, as I have intimated before. We furnished materials, because at that time I don't think the League of Women Voters was publishing material, and oftentimes we would make out lists of material on and books to read, and especially material. We would get as much information as we could on the persons who were running for office, and we'd place the material there for the citizens. And that was about as much as we could do at that particular time in connection with our program.
And so this kind of serving as a resource
Yes.
began as early as 1946 then?
Yes, yes.
That's wonderful. We were getting into, you had started on another very interesting topic, which is the desegregation of the main city library. And in your book you describe in detail this effort and how it came about. And what I'd like to do is go into a little bit more detail there with other aspects that you feel are important. One thing that I'm struck by, as you were describing it in the book, is that this effort began in 1953, so even before the landmark Brown decision outlawing segregation in public schools. And I wondered if, as you were first having the discussions with the Friends of the Library, were you anticipating the Supreme Court's decision? Did you know that there was that kind of legal effort going on?
Frankly, no, I didn't. I was just interested in the library being desegregated, because naturally our citizens were paying tax. They were taxpayers, and yet they were not receiving all of the funds result from their taxes by the library being closed to them. And in addition to that, citizens were becoming more interested in reading. As the years went by, they became more interested in reading and getting materials. And our branches, we were branch libraries, and we often didn't have the type of materials, or we didn't have enough materials to furnish a citizen on whatever the citizen might be looking for. And the citizens knew that this material was in the library, the main library, or maybe in some of the other larger branches, but the library and the branches, the white branches we called them then, were closed. And so there came this great push on the part of several groups in our city. And one of them was a group which I organized, which was called the Friends of the Library. This Friends of the Library was the first Friends of the Library in the Atlanta, and it was a Carnegie Library then. Was the first group organized. We had the National Friends of the Library, but I organized this group. And one of my reasons for organizing this Friends of the Library group was to, first of all, to have these citizens work with us, to get citizens interested in using the branches, and also in order in help and asking them to help to get the library desegregated. I knew that as a member of the staff, I could not fight that battle. But I knew that I had to have somebody to help fight that battle for us. And so I organized this Friends of the Library group, and we would sit and talk about various things that we needed to do. And in addition to that, another group became interested in working with the Friends of the Library and in helping to get the library desegregated. And that was the American Council on Human Affairs. And that council was Whitney Young, who was the dean of the library school at Atlanta University, was the secretary for that group. And Whitney was a great library user. He loved the library. And there were several other members who were outstanding members of that council. And they were interested in seeing that the library would become desegregated. And so for over a period of 4 years, this American Council, which Whitney Young was the secretary of, and they worked for about 4 years with the Board of Trustees at the Atlanta Public Library, seeking to get them to consider desegregating the library. They had a very difficult time with the board because the board felt that they had provided enough service for black citizens in the three black branches, and therefore they felt that the service was adequate. And they also stated that black citizens do not use the library as much as the white citizens, and therefore they felt that the service was adequate. But we knew that the service was not adequate. In addition to that group, another group became interested in helping to get the library desegregated, and that group was known as the AMVETS. The AMVETS had a chapter here in Atlanta, and that group wrote letters and contacted the library board of trustees, but they were not able to make much headway. then any number of citizens, concerned citizens, and people from the Atlanta University Center would make contact with the library board and with the librarians, but so far they had not been able to make much headway in that direction. So, as a result, when the library board found out that they were going to be sued, that there would become a suit would be set up to force the library to open its doors, the library board still prolonged and procrastinated, and they the library board then asked the police department and the mayor of Atlanta and several other persons in power to uh, substantiate the fact that the library could continue moving in its segregated fashion. But the police department and the mayor said that there was no law, no written law saying that the library, that they could assist the library in continuing its segregated policy. As a result, in the final analysis, rather, the the American Council of Human Relations set itself up to bring a lawsuit against the Library Board of Trustees, and Mrs. Irene Dobbs Jackson and another young minister from the Atlanta University system.
Was it Otis
Moss, yes,
Right.
Reverend Otis Moss, who was a minister, and he was studying at the university at that time. They were the two persons chosen to bring this suit against the library. When the mayor found out that this suit was about to be instigated, he took it up with the library board and said that he did not go along with their decision and that the library should be desegregated, and therefore he met with the board, and some of the members still held out, but the library board finally voted to desegregate the library, but they still held out a day or two longer. And but one of the library board members who was interested in not having a suit brought against them called Whitney Young and asked him to hold off a day or two longer until they could have another meeting to get the board members functioning in that direction. And Whitney Young was able to get the members to hold off a while longer. And the next day, after the board had its last meeting, Whitney Young was called and told that the library board had decided to desegregate the library and to give the librarians a chance to get the word out to the librarians and get set up for this purpose. One of the things, so the library was desegregated, and Whitney Young was able to write in his report that after 4 years of working with the library board of trustees, that the library was finally desegregated. I want to give credit here to one of the persons who was outstanding in a peculiar way in this desegregation story, and that was Mr. John C. Settlemeyer, who was the director of libraries. Mr. Settlemeyer was never interested in the library, the segregation policy of the library. And oftentimes in our conversations, in our private conversations, he always told me this. And he always worked as hard as he could. Since he could not work with the library board and be a member of, work as a head of the library, he couldn't go against their policy. On the other hand, he was not in agreement with their policies. So what he attempted to do was to make the black branches as complete as possible. But that could only go so far. A branch is a branch, after all, and many things that the citizens needed were not in the branches. And so Mr. Settlemeyer did attempt to make our branches as equal as possible, but that still, it was a segregated policy. But he was never in agreement with the board, and several times in their meetings he would call attention to the fact that black citizens are coming into the library and they're demanding use of the library. And it is very difficult for me to say that you cannot use the library, you will have to go to one of the main libraries. And he said, I'm having a difficult time. So the board suggested that he call in the police department, but the police department said that we cannot do this. There is no law, really, against this policy. And so we cannot help you in this respect. And Mr. Settlemeyer called attention to the fact that several other libraries in the South had desegregated the libraries, and he felt that it was time for us to do the same. So even though Mr. Settlemeyer, was working with as a director of libraries, but he never at heart was a segregationist, and he did everything he could to get the board to desegregate. But it was really Mayor Hartsfield to whom most of us have given the credit for the board taking the position that it did. And two reasons that Mr. Hartsfield had in mind. Mr. Hartsfield loved the library. Mr. Hartsfield did not have a formal education. He received most of his education through the public library. He loved the public library, and he knew what the library meant to educate citizens. And this was one of his main objectives for desegregating libraries. Secondly, black citizens were the ones who kept Mr. Hartsfield through their votes in the position that he was in, and he did not intend to lose that large number of votes, because at that time we had close to 30,000 black citizens who were voting, and Mr. Hartsfield did not want to lose that large number of votes. So this, in a nutshell, is how the library became desegregated, and some of the main groups that helped to desegregate the library. There were others too, and one other group that I must give credit to were the citizens. I'm sorry, the students in the sit-in movement. Those students marched in, they sat in, and they did everything that was in their power to help to get the library desegregated. They would go in and sit in the library, and they would ask for materials which they knew was not in the black branches, and they would work in that connection to help get the library desegregated.
The library was desegregated in 1959, is that correct? That would have been before the appeal for human rights was published and that sort of thing. So before the sit-in movement began up in Greensboro.
That's right.
But are you saying that some of the same students that became involved in the sit-in movement were involved in 1959 in the library effort?
Yes.
Mm.
Yes, I am.
Mm-hmm.
The sit-in movement, as you said, started in Greensboro, North Carolina. But those students, if you remember, uh, the idea spread, and it spread to different states in the city, in our country, and many of those students would move from one city to the other. They were called the Freedom Riders, and these students would go into the various cities, and oftentimes they would come into our library, the West Hunter branch and the Auburn branch and the University Homes branch, and they would sit there and they would have meetings in the library. They have their own meetings in the library, and they did a good bit in that respect. So, yes, the movement did start. The freedom movement, that is the Freedom Riders, those students, they did start before 1959, and many of the time I have seen those students come into our library. They were tired. Some of them had been beaten. Some of them were hungry, and they were in very dilapidated looking circumstances, and they didn't have anywhere to go until they would have their meeting, maybe that evening, and they would sit in the library because the library was open for them, and they would sit in the library and wait until time to go to their meetings. And oftentimes I would talk with them and encourage them in their activity. So it was quite a movement, and it did spread throughout. And as I say, by the students here in Atlanta were worked just as hard, and they would have meetings at our libraries too.
Mm-hmm.
And several of the students who were outstanding in that movement, one of the most outstanding was Julian Bond. Julian Bond, his mother is a librarian, one of the librarians at Atlanta University now, and his father, Mr. Bond, was an outstanding, he at one time was president of the school in, I think it was Forsyth, Georgia. Anyhow, he was president of one of the schools in Georgia, and then he moved from that school to Atlanta University, where he was head of the education department. And there were any number of other students, I can't remember the names now, that participated in that program.
For the students, the library served as a place where they could rest and in between activities.
Yes.
Was there any other way that you or the branches were able to be of assistance to the student sit-in movement?
Really, no. They didn't request very much of us. They were just happy to use the meeting rooms, and they didn't use the meeting rooms too often because they met in different parts of the city. Because I can remember the meeting at Pascal's, one of the eating places here. They met in different parts of the city, so that they didn't require a lot of help from us. They were more or less a very independent group. I can remember, though, talking with many of the mothers, some of the students who lived near the West Hunter branch, in this section which surrounds the West Hunter branch. They were in that sit-in movement, and some of them were, when they would sit in at Rich's and places like that, and when they would be picked up by the police department and carried to the jails or carried to the places wherever they would have the students, the mothers would come in and talk with us and feel very hurt because their kids were either in jail or they were in some place wherever they took the students. I don't remember the name, where they would take these students and hold them until they could be released. and mothers would come in and feel very sad and hurt, and we would give them as much consolation as possible. But that was about all we could really do in that respect.
Do you remember the names of some of the mothers that came in to the library? Do you recall who you saw?
Yes, I'll have to come back to that.
Okay.
The mother's face is very clear to me. I can't remember the mother's name now. Maybe I can
Okay.
remember it later.
If it comes to
Yeah.
you later, we'll just interject it. One of the things I would be curious about is this might be a way of connecting to the development of the Black History collection, and I know that out of the student sit-in movement came SNCC, and that group of students, for example, when they were working in Mississippi, they had freedom schools, and
Yeah.
one of the things that they did was to teach Black history. And I wondered if the SNCC group in Atlanta, to your knowledge, did that, and if so, did they turn to the library and its Black history collection for some of the resources?
Hold that point and let me say first how this collection was built. Would that
That'd be great.
Let me start there, and then I'll pick up on this question that you have just asked. When I came to the Auburn Branch Library, there was a small collection of books on Black history, a very small collection of books on Black history. It was a circulating collection. When the adult education project closed in 1934, they had quite a sizable collection of books on Black history. They gave when the project closed, they gave that collection of books to the library. We brought that collection of books upstairs and placed it on the shelves of the library, and we called it the Negro History Collection, but it was a special collection because it did not circulate. Down through the years, we continued to add to that collection. Several rare books were added to that collection, and other books were added to that collection. We will not give, when I asked the main library for funds to increase that collection, I was told there was no money to buy a special collection of books for that collection. The library did not have funds to buy a special collection. I was determined not to be outdone, so I decided.
Would you just mention here what year it was that you had asked the library for funds to make additional purchases?
When I became a head librarian at the Auburn Branch Library in 1939, I wanted to increase the collection of Black history books that we had, and I requested funds from the main library to add to the collection, and I was told that the library did not have funds to support a special collection. I was determined not to be outdone, and I decided that would be other ways in which I could support this collection. And frequently when writers and other citizens who had written books, like Langston Hughes, and men who would come to Atlanta to speak at Atlanta University or speak at the Y or wherever they might be speaking, when they would bring their books, I would always purchase a copy of that book and have them autograph it with my personal funds, and I would add that book to that collection. And as you know, during Atlanta being the center that it is and was even then, when we had different men who had written books, they would come to speak, and I would always purchase a book and add to that collection. Now, sometimes they would give me a book for our collection. I would tell them that we were collecting books for that special collection. Then, the larger the collection grew, the citizens became interested in the collection, and oftentimes we would be given books from the citizens to add to the collection. So the collection continued to grow, and in addition to that, we had one of the sororities, the Iota Phi Lambda sorority, has a chapter here in Atlanta, and they became interested in what we were doing, and they offered to give. They were meeting in our library, and they offered to give us books for that collection. And what I suggested to them was that Anna Bontemps, one of the outstanding black uh, writers of children's books, we needed books for the children too. And they decided to use that as their project, and they would give us funds once a year to purchase books for the Anna Bontemps collection. Now, the Anna Bontemps collection was in our Black History collection, but they were the books for the children. And that collection grew and grew until the library made some other changes. But finally, the main library, the librarian there, became interested in our collection. She saw that it was growing and how much interest was being developed in this collection, that they gave me $25 a year to buy books for that collection. And she also gave me the name of a lady a little lady who had a bookshop, who collected books, rare books on black history. And she gave me the name of that lady, and I would purchase books from this little lady. She would send me her handwritten lists of books, and I would select books from that collection. And at that time, we were given $25 to spend for that collection, and the money did increase later on. In that collection, I also saw the need for having our black periodicals bound. So we had the Crisis magazine and the other black periodicals, and the Atlanta Daily World we had put on microfilm. And that collection stayed at Auburn Branch until the West Hunter branch was opened. When Mr. Settlemeyer saw the interest that had been invested and the time and money that had been spent in that collection, when the plans were built, when the plans were developed for the West Hunter branch, a special room was built just to house that collection. So when I was moved from Auburn Branch to West Hunter Branch, the collection moved with me, and it was housed in that collection until it was finally moved to the Atlanta Public Library. And when it was moved to the Atlanta Public Library in the 1960s, it was named for Reverend Samuel W. Williams, who was an outstanding minister at Morehouse College, and he was also an outstanding member of CRC, Community Relations Council. Yes. So that's how that collection grew, and that collection now will be transferred to the to the Afro-American Library Research Library, which will be opened in 1993 on Auburn Avenue. One thing I do want to say that the citizens were very interested in that collection, and they gave us from those who had books that would fit in that collection, they would give their books to that collection.
Do you recall the names of some of the donors to the collection?
Right now, I can't. Names
Mm-hmm.
elude me. But I do remember Langston Hughes gave us books for that collection. And Killens, one of the black writers, gave some books to that collection. Um, uh, Other citizens, I can't remember their names now.
Okay. The question that started us off on this was my wondering if any of the SNCC students or as SNCC evolved and became interested in teaching Black history. Do you know, as the SNCC started a project in Atlanta, I believe it was in 1963, do you know if they made use of this collection or had other relations with you in the library?
Yes, most of the students that I knew in SNCC were library users. I found the students that I knew in SNCC were college students and high schools, some of the high schools, who were highly intelligent students. And they liked books and reading. So several of them grew up in our libraries, in our branches. And they love the library, and they although, as I say, they oftentimes did not meet in the library as such, but they knew about the library and what it meant to them.
Mm-hmm.
And they worked closely with us in various other ways, and we went to several of their meetings and talked with them. There was another point that I was going to make about SNCC that it right now doesn't come to me, but it will, I'm sure, because I do want to give them the credit that is due them. Oh, yes. They were interested in Black history, no doubt about it. And I do know that for a while, the Atlanta Board of Education had more or less eliminated on their reading lists books on Black history.
And when was this?
This is during these years.
So in the
In the
mid-60s?
yes.
Early to mid-60s?
Yes, yes, early 60s, and even maybe a little bit before then. The lists were not many of the Black history books were not listed, and you didn't find many of the books known on library shelves. And we found that the students went all out for promoting Black history and Black studies. And I can remember at several of our club meetings, they would meet with us and promote the interest in Black studies, because they were trying to get Black studies set up in the public schools and in the colleges. So they did play a large part in developing an interest in Black studies.
You just mentioned in club meetings, and what club was that? Is this the...
Well, one of the clubs that I remember so very well, I am a member of the Utopian Literary Club, The Utopian Literary Club is one of Atlanta's oldest black women's clubs, and several times in several of our meetings, uh, students from SNCC would come in to our meetings, and we would give them an opportunity to talk about their interest in promoting black studies. And I remember at one of our meetings, we were meeting at this particular time at Pascal's, and the room in which we were meeting was open. It didn't have doors to keep people from barging in. And one of our speakers, Dr. Virginia Lacey Jones, who was head of the Atlanta University School of Library Science, was speaking, and several of the students just barged right in and asked us to give them an opportunity to speak to us on their interest in promoting black studies, black history studies in our colleges. And so often, when I was one of the reference librarians at Georgia State University, I have helped in a number of those students to find material on black studies and black what is it, black literature, but there was another term I wanted to use. This young man wanted to write his dissertation on. That slips me right now. But yes, they were very interested in seeing that black studies be put in the program.
How did back on the incident with the Utopian Club, how did the members of the club respond when the students came in as they did?
It was interesting. I didn't want to get into it, but Dr. Jones was up speaking. I don't remember what Dr. Jones was talking to us about. And 3 or 4 of the students came into the room, and we were surprised because they were students, and we wondered why they were coming in. And we noted that one of the young women walked over to the table and sat at the table where Dr. Jones was speaking, and the others sat in the audience. And when Dr. Jones got through, the president asked the students who they were and why they were there. And this is why they told us they had come. And they said that in case we did not give them the opportunity to talk about black studies and about promoting black studies in the colleges and at the schools, they would talk anyway. They would take over. But we were very happy to give them that opportunity to do so.
Did at that time, did you or did anybody else talk about the efforts you had over the years to develop a black history collection?
If I remember correctly, we did talk with them, and we did encourage them. I'm sure they knew, because 2 of the students I knew they were students or children of some of my friends, and I knew that they had used the library, and I knew that I had talked with them any number of times, so that we did have a close relationship with them. But I understand that they made their rounds in a number of clubs and other organizations promoting the study of black history, and that students' appeal, that appeal,
the appeal for human rights.
Yes,
right.
that was, I think that was one of the outstanding documents that was done by that group.
That's a fascinating story about the coming to the club. That's very
interesting.
Yes,
they forced themselves in. They were not invited, because Dr. Jones and her husband were our speakers, But they came right on in and told us what they wanted to do, what they wanted to talk about. And they said that if we had not given them the opportunity, they were going to do it anyway.
Was there discussion amongst the members afterwards about
Yes,
what had happened?
yes, naturally, being older members, we thought about the audacity of the group, and but we were sympathetic. We understood, and we felt pretty much we felt the same as they did, that we needed to get black studies in the school programs and in the colleges and universities.
Do you remember just what year it was that this event took place? Were you still in the West Hunter branch, or had you moved over to Georgia State by then?
No, I was at West Hunter Branch, so that must have been the late 1950s. That must have been that was I was still at West Hunter Branch Library, and I did not leave West Hunter Branch until 1966. So it must have been somewhere in
sometime
that time.
after the appeal for human rights, and
Yes.
so that's still a 5-year period, but somewhere between
Yes.
1960 and 1966. Okay.
Yes.
There's one other, I guess I'd say, major political issue in Atlanta that that I'd be interested in knowing about your recollections on. And when you spoke earlier, you mentioned that the library board placed strict limits on the political participation of librarians, that was something that they kept a close watch on. And actually, before I get into the topic of school desegregation, I wondered if the library board had any opposition to the voter registration work that was done in the library, or was that fine by them?
In the early years, we were not given permission to allow political groups to meet in the library.
Mm-hmm.
But that changed over the years. When and how when it changed, I don't know. I couldn't give a date, but I do know that our meeting rooms in the beginning were not open
Mm-hmm.
to political groups. But I feel that this, especially with the civil rights movement beginning, that changed, because when groups would meet at our library, we had no problem, no problem at all. So that times do make for great changes.
Might it have been at some point in the 1950s that these restrictions were changed?
I would say with the civil right, with the opening of the civil rights movement.
So more in the 1960s then, perhaps?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
The other topic I wanted to discuss briefly was school desegregation, because I think that just at the same time that the student movement was getting going was the culmination of the legal effort to bring school desegregation to Atlanta. So it was in the fall of 1961 that the schools desegregated, but also that the library board was against the political participation of the librarians at the branches. But I wondered if you and other librarians were able to find a way to work with the NAACP or the teachers or the students or the parents on school desegregation.
First of all, let me say, although I was hired by the Board of Trustees to do a job at the library, but there were some things that I felt that they could not have any control over, and especially something in the nature of some of the organizations which I participated in, as long as I didn't let it affect my work in the library. And my connections with the NAACP, my connections with the Negro Voters League, or my connection with some of the other voters leagues, groups that had to do with politics. I participated in those in off hours. I felt that the board didn't have any right to draw the line there. So, and most of the meetings that we attended, my staff and I attended, they were usually held in the evenings because most people worked, and the meetings were not until evening. We would go to the Wheat Street Baptist Church, which was up the street from us. We would go to Martin Luther King's church, Ebenezer Baptist Church, when they would hold meetings, or the YWCA or the YMCA, or other places where these groups were meeting. And I felt the board didn't have that right to say that I could not participate in those meetings so long as I did not let it interfere with my work.
Mm-hmm. Do you recall anything in particular in the way of assistance or advice on school desegregation?
I'm not very much knowledgeable about that as such.
Mm-hmm.
We did not participate as a group, that is the library, in the school desegregation plan. I don't think I have any information that I can impart there on school desegregation. We did work with several women's clubs, but most of the women's clubs had different programs. Some of them were interested in social programs, some of them were interested in educational programs. But school desegregation as such, I didn't participate in very much.
Mm-hmm.
And yet, in a way, the library did, because we were educating citizens. And I oftentimes, before we had school libraries, because when I came, we did not have school libraries. And the students had to use the libraries, and we taught the students. This was a schedule. The students were scheduled to come to the library for library lessons, and we taught them how to use the library.
Mm-hmm.
And we had story hour for the students. We did work with the school and the schools and their program, but on the matter of desegregating the schools, I don't think we participated very much, as I remember now.
I'll just ask you about one particular event in that case. The Sibley Commission hearings in the city in March of 1960.
Yeah.
I've looked at the transcript of the hearings, and I ran across the name of I'm not sure I'm pronouncing it right, but Mrs. Mexico Michaelbury.
Mickleberry. Mexico Mickleberry.
Mickleberry.
Yes.
Okay. She spoke at the hearings, but she spoke on behalf of an organization called Jack and Jill, the Mothers Organization.
Yes.
But I also learned from your book that she was an assistant librarian.
Yes.
So I was interested in that. So when she went to the Sibley Commission hearings, she spoke more as a parent or as a mother, but she did have this other work role as well.
Yes, I knew Mrs. Mickleberry. She came to work with us as a children's librarian. She was a very dynamic person. She was a graduate of the Atlanta University Library School, and she was hired as our children's librarian. She did an excellent job as a children's librarian. And when she left us to go to Spelman to be the librarian there, because she was a graduate of Spelman, she continued her work in the community, because she had learned from us how important it was to work in the community, because this is the role of a public library. We work widely in our communities, and when she went to Spelman, she continued her work as in many of the community activities which she had participated in originally. But the main person that I knew who was outstanding with the Sibley Committee was Margaret Davis Bowen. Margaret Davis Bowen was the wife of our bishop, Bishop W.E. Bowen, who was the bishop of our Methodist church, and they lived just above the West Hunter Branch Library. Mrs. Bowen, like Mrs. Blackburn, was although she was a bishop's wife and she worked in the churches, she also was outstanding in her civic activities. And she was one of the few persons that I know, black persons I know, that worked with that Sibley Committee. And she made she would pass by the library telling me she was on her way to those meetings of the Sibley hearings. And I don't know any other black persons who worked with that committee, but I do know Mrs. Bowen was outstanding in that field, and she would come back and give us the information that went on in those committee meetings. And in one of my books, in the book that I have compiled, you will find information on Margaret Davis Bowen and on that Sibley Committee.
Right.
Yes.
The committee hearings did certainly get a lot of coverage in the papers, and so I'm sure that's.
And I indexed
right.
a lot of it in my in my indexes. And Margaret Davis Bowen was one of the most outstanding women that we had in that with that group. Now, I'm sure. Well, I don't know how many others participated in that. Black people participated in it, but I know she did.
I know that Hattie Goodman spoke on behalf of the PTAs or the Congress of Colored Parents and Teachers at the time. But I do recall Mrs. Bowen speaking as well. She was in attendance there and did speak directly to in the hearings.
Yes.
Are there other, Mrs. Bowen being one, are there other black women that you recall as having been very involved in the school desegregation?
No, frankly, I don't know. I can't remember any of the names of any of those women who participated in that program.
Okay. Actually, I have a general question about the role, your role, and the role of the black branches of the libraries. In your book, you describe the branch libraries as a cultural and intellectual center in the community between 1920 and 1959, before desegregation, and other people have talked about how important the churches were and how important the Atlanta University schools were. And I wondered if you saw, or I guess the way to ask the question would be, what was the particular role of the libraries? How did it differ from these other institutions that were so important?
You mean, how did the public library differ from...
What was the particular role of the library in making itself a cultural and intellectual center relative to these other institutions?
Well, the public library is the citizens' library, and it is set up to provide material, books, and other sources of material for the education of the citizen. As Miss Rose, a former librarian in the New York Public Library, stated, and I often think of her quote, she stated that the public library is one with the school in that it educates its citizens. End of quote. And the public library is an institution set up to fight ignorance. It's set up to help citizens in all their activities, and the in turn the citizens become better citizens when they know, when they have information. It makes them better citizens. And to me, this is an outstanding role of the library. The public library can go reach out into the community a little bit differently from the some of the other institutions in the community. And the public library also has a somewhat a different clientele from the university or from the schools. Yet there is, there is this crossover because the public library deals with all aspects of citizens. But we are broader in our service. We're not as specialized, so to speak, in our service as, say, the library, school, or the urban league, or some of the other centers in the community. So that we do cut across many aspects of the citizens' life.
Mm-hmm. So the potential for reaching a wider audience is what you see as important.
Yes, it is very important. And then you see many citizens never participate in some of these other institutions, and they have no particular interest in participating in these other institutions. And the library reaches out for those citizens and brings them into the library. Take, for example, the average citizen, after he leaves high school or college, oftentimes he's busy with his work and his home activities, and he doesn't have time to participate in some particular institution. And so he is lost, and the public library will reach out and try to pull that citizen in and give him some source to remain intact with, whereas some of the other institutions can't or don't feel that obligation to do so. So that there is a wide difference in a way
Mm-hmm.
from what our activities are. I'm not sure that I have answered that just as I really want to, but I'm trying to show how the public library belongs to all the citizens, and it's not just one particular group. That although all groups can use the library too, because they are tax-paying citizens. And the library and its programs are open to practically every citizen. And when the librarians find out that the citizens are interested in certain types of activities, they will start a program of that type. Now, you mentioned the club that Mrs. Mickleberry uh, was part of, the Jack and Jill's.
Right.
Now, the Jack and Jill's are an active group of young mothers that we have worked with down through the years, but they are interested more or less in one particular group, and that group belongs to them, their children. And the library is not only interested in the mothers of that group, but we're interested in the children too. So we do cut across all of these other activity, other citizens groups and their interests.
Right. I'm wondering if we can spend a little bit of time on a group that, when we spoke last time, you had mentioned as being very important to you, which was the Metropolitan Atlanta Association for the Blind,
Yeah.
which you referred to very briefly
Yeah.
in your book and its connection to the library. But am I right in thinking that your involvement with that organization went beyond its connection with the library? Is that correct?
Yes, it did. I'll start at the beginning. When I came to the library, enough blind people came to the library for me to recognize them as a group and to recognize that there was no program set up in our city for the blind. I have always been interested in the various groups in the community, and I was determined to do what could be done to help those blind citizens. I therefore made a survey and found out how many blind citizens, these are black citizens because we're still in the age of segregation. I found out how many black citizens there were in Atlanta, and I found out that they were having a meeting at one of the churches, and I went to that meeting, and I told that group of my interest in them, and I wanted to pledge them my support as a citizen and as a librarian. They were very happy to have me come in, and they had no place to meet. So I invited them to meet at the library. We had a lovely meeting room, and they met at the library. I invited them to meet at the library.
And was this at the Auburn?
This was at the Auburn Branch Library.
And what year did this begin?
That was in the late 30s or early 40s. So they met at the library. Then I saw the need for getting them organized, and I organized them, and we called ourselves Atlanta Blind Association, as near as I can remember that, what we called ourselves in, and we were organized. At the same time, there came to the city P.J. Woods. P.J. Woods was a blind man, and he had worked with the United States government, and he was sent to Atlanta to investigate the work activities that had been set up in Georgia for the blind, and there was very little that had been set up for both black or white. But he came to investigate the program that was set up in Georgia for the blind. He was down at this meeting that I attended, and when he heard of my interest, we got together and he came to the library, and it was through P.J. Woods that I learned as much as I did about working with the blind. And in as a result, our program was composed of two parts. The library's program for the blind, which included bringing in citizens to talk to the blind. It included a course in Negro history. I taught that course in Negro history. It included other activities which from the community. Our D.A. Reed, who was an outstanding professor at Atlanta University, men like that, we would bring them in to talk and educate the blind. That was the library's program for the blind, plus getting these books, Braille books, and talking book machines, and teaching them how to use the Braille books. And we had a teacher who taught, one of the members of the blind group was a teacher of Braille. She taught them how to use Braille, learn Braille, and also how to use the talking book machines. That was the library's program for this group. Their program, they learned, the government furnished them materials and taught them and to learn how to make leather goods. And they made leather pocketbooks. They also learned how to make brooms and so on. And they formed what was known as a thrift club. And they would sell these materials and put their money into this thrift club. Then they would take the money and put that little money that they got from the sale of their goods in the Citizens Trust Bank, in a Christmas saving club. That group grew. It finally outgrew the library, and then the library told me that we had housed them for about 4 years, and they felt that I should let the group move on to some other place. They didn't feel that we should just give them a permanent place, so they moved in to the Congregational Church, and I continued working with them, and finally we got enough money, and we rented a place, and we stayed in this rented place for many years. Then finally, they raised enough money and they bought that place. But I still worked with them, carrying on the library program, educating the blind. And finally, they bought another place over here on Simpson Avenue. And at that time, we had changed our name. We moved from Atlanta Blind Association to the Metropolitan Atlanta Association for the Black Blind. Then later on we became integrated and we called ourselves Metropolitan Atlanta Association for the Blind.
Which is the name
that you have now, but we went through all those various stages. So that the library's program was, we continued that library program right through until there came a change down through the years. Changes do participate, and when the United Way came in, and we began the setup just changed altogether, and the association became a part of the United Way program, and that made for a big change. And finally, by that time, though, I had resigned from the library and gone to Georgia State University. Did that answer?
Mm-hmm. I'm interested that it sounds like perhaps your involvement was about 25 years. Would it have run into the mid-1960s?
It did.
Mm-hmm.
Yes.
And was the association taken over by the United Way as soon as the United Way got going? Do you recall?
Well, the United Way, they had certain stipulations that they set up, and now I don't remember what those stipulations were, but it changed our whole process. And one of the things that was changed was the matter of collecting funds. We could not, at that, before the United Way came into our lives, we those of us who could give money to support the organization did so, and then the blind people themselves raised money, and then they sold these products which they made, and that kept the organization going. But when the United Way came in, that we had to change that plan, and but I still continued to work with them on a matter of education, providing uh, reading materials and discussion groups and book reviews and things of that nature. Did I answer your question?
I think I just have one other aspect. I wondered, do you recall what year the Colored Blind Association became integrated with what previously was the White Association for the Blind?
It must have been sometime in the 50s, but I don't remember the dates, no.
Right.
But it was in the 50s, because I worked with the group through 1966 when I left the library. And we had been a part of the program. It must have been somewhere in late 50s.
This might be difficult for you to know, since your participation ended at a certain point, but I wondered if you had any sense of when when the integration of the groups took place, if there was any change in the services offered to the black blind. Was it what the character of the change was?
After I left in 1966, I lost contact with the group because I was working at Georgia State at that time, and I lost contact. And then too, the whole program had changed so that I had begun to lose interest, not in my work in a way with the blind, but the program had changed so radically that we were not functioning as we had originally. And then a new manager came in, and they were not particularly interested in the type of program that the library had set up. By this time, they were going full force into their financial raising of money and that type of thing, plus following the regulations stipulated by the others. So I don't have much recollection of what happened after that time.
Okay. Taking off in a completely different direction here, but when we first met in April, you had some wonderful stories about some of the leading political figures in Atlanta, and how you got to know them when they were quite young by virtue of their using the Auburn branch. And I'd love to record your recollections, particularly of Martin Luther King Jr. and Maynard Jackson. So if you wouldn't mind recounting those stories for us.
During my years as a librarian, I have come in contact with some of the finest young people that our city and our nation has ever known. And I'm happy that I had a part in helping them on their way. I found too that many of these outstanding people in any city, in any state, use the library. And so we had some outstanding young people to come to the library, and this is true throughout our nation. I have some very fond memories of some of our outstanding citizens, and one of them is Martin Luther was Martin Luther King Jr. Martin Luther was lived just a few doors above the Auburn Branch Library, and he came to the library many times during the week, and he loved to read, and oftentimes he would come to the library and he would walk up to the desk and he would look me straight in the eye, and I'd say, "Hello, Martin Luther, what's on your mind?" He'd say, "Oh, nothing particularly." Said, "But what did you do today at school?" "Oh, nothing particularly. We didn't do very much particularly." And throughout our conversation, he would keep using the word particularly. I noticed then that Martin Luther had learned a new word, and that word was particularly, and I would continue to play up that word until he got it fastened in his mind. Each time he would learn a big word, as we called it then, he would come and try it out on me, and we would play this game, and I would use that word over and over again to satisfy Martin Luther. Another game we played through his years as an elementary school student. I was lucky when I went to public school. We had excellent teachers in reading and in memory gems. We had to learn memory gems, and I learned a lot of poetry during my years in public school. And sometimes Martin Luther would come up to the desk and he'd stand, and I could always tell when he wanted to say something in particular. And I would ask him what was on his mind and how he was feeling. He'd say, "I dipped into the future, far as human eye could see." And then I would finish that line. That's a poem. "For I dipped into the future, far as human eye could see, saw a vision of the world and the wonders that would be." He had learned that verse, and I had learned it when I was a young person. And every time Martin Luther would learn a memory gem, he would come to the library and he would start the verse, and then I would repeat it. And we played that game down through the years, repeating memory gems. The thing that I am most conscious of Martin Luther was his interest in the books that we had in this collection that were on Gandhi and the Gandhi movement. These books had been given to us by the Adult Education Project. They were in that collection of books that they had given to us. And somehow Martin Luther found out that those books were in that collection. And he wanted to read the books. And I told him that because they were in the adult collection, I could not check the books out to him. At that time, we had a regulation where adult books could not be checked out on children's cards. And this bothered me because I knew Martin Luther could read the books. And I thought of a plan that he could get the books. So I told him to ask his father to come and get a library card, and I would check the books out to him on his father's card. And that's how I made it possible for Martin Luther to read those books on Gandhi. And what I'm saying is that at a very early age, I don't know how he got interested in Gandhi. He may have come to some of those meetings that the Adult Education Project had with his father in those discussions. He may have heard them. I don't know how he heard about Gandhi and the Gandhi movement, but that's where he started reading those books on the Gandhi movement. And he read every one of those books that we had. Now, in the case of Maynard Jackson, Maynard, as a boy, would come to the library with his father. His father would bring Maynard and his sisters to the library, especially in the summer. and to pick up their library books, and then they would take the library books on up to the David T. Howard to the program during the summer, the playground. They had a playground up at the high school, and Maynard would come up the libraries. I could see Maynard coming up the library steps with this big brown paper bag in his hand. He would come into the library, go all around the children's room, and select all the books that he wanted to read and take out. And he'd come back to the table and place these books on the table in his brown paper bag. And he would go through these books, selecting the ones that he wanted. And at my desk, which was somewhat hidden from the main desk, I would hear this paper bag being opened. And I found out that Maynard would go into this bag and be eating his lunch in the library. And I informed Maynard that we did not eat in the library, that we did not eat when we were reading books. And he would say, "Yes, Miss Waters," and he would fold up the bag and put it away, and he'd start reading again. And I'd go back to my desk, but later on, I'd hear that bag opening again. To make the story short, Maynard loved to eat while he was reading. And when I told this story some time ago at one of our trustee meetings, his mother told me that Maynard still loves to eat and read books. So he still reads and eats while he's eating.
He
Reading.
never outgrew his habit from the Auburn Library days.
No. One other short story. There was I had a page who came in the afternoons and slipped and shared the books to put on the shelves. And there was one little fella who came to the library several times a week, and he was a friend of our page. The fellow's name slips my memory now, but I would say to him, "You'll have to leave the desk. You're hindering the people coming to the desk." And he would move over to the side, or sometimes he would have a seat. And one day he became, shall I say, a little bit annoyed with me because I insisted that he go sit down. And he looked me in the eye and he said, "How do you expect me to be a librarian if you're going to have me sit? I'm trying to stand here and learn how to be a librarian." Well, I said to myself, thank goodness. So I said, "I tell you what you do. You go have a seat and I'll think about it. When you grow old enough, you come back to the library and I will teach you how to be a librarian." Sure enough, when he got old enough for us to hire him as a page, we hired him as a page, and he learned what he could then. Years later, he went to the Atlanta University Library School, and he finished his library school, and then he went to Columbia University Library School, and he got his master's, and perhaps I think he has his doctorate, and he is now the head librarian at Lincoln University. Now I could go on with stories like that, how we encourage students to become librarians.
I had one other question for you, which is that in reading your book, I came across an interesting comment of yours in the chapter when you're describing the decade covering from 1950 to 1960 and the changes that took place in Atlanta at that time. You made a comment that this time included, and your words were, the push of black women reaching out for more and better recognition. And I'd be interested in hearing some examples of that push as you saw it. What activities you would put in that category?
Well, this was a period of black women becoming interested in a variety of activities and ways. They were beginning to push out into the community. I think part of it is due to the times. I think after the say after the civil rights movement, and even before then, we had a very strong YWCA, and many of us were members of the YWCA and took part in their activities. And then we began to see women being hired in various places, and some of them were even head of a few businesses. I remember Mrs. King, who had her father had a business down on Auburn Avenue, and he was in, I believe it was real estate, and they had a real estate office, and she worked in that office.
Is that a Nina King?
Yeah, I don't remember her name now, yeah, but anyway, Cornelius King was her father, and he had a business down on Auburn Avenue, and she worked with him. And then we had women pushing out into the social work area. You know, we had the School of Social Work, and we had any number of those graduates were women, and several of them had worked in various positions. And then then the library school also graduated women librarians, more women than they did men. So there was just this general growth of women out going into various activities and doing a very good job at it. And so many of the housewives too were beginning to move out. Some of them were college graduates, and they were beginning to move out into the community. And then we mustn't overlook the outstanding black women's clubs, like the Chautauqua Literary Club. That's the oldest black women's club in Atlanta, and those women were active in various pursuits of the city. And the Atlanta Life Insurance Company, one of its outstanding women became a member of the Board of Trustees, and held an outstanding position with Atlanta Life Insurance Company. And then the Atlanta Daily World, Mr. Scott's wife, his sister-in-law, and even now his daughter were large participants in the community, as well as working at the Atlanta World paper. And I guess then we had the Nurses Association, Public Health Nursing Association. Dr. Baycoat's wife, Lucia, an outstanding nurse in the Nursing Metropolitan Atlanta Association. Gladys Powell, outstanding person who was hired by the Atlanta Gas Company to do demonstrations on their gas stoves. And so there just began to be this great push of women into various activities. But I think probably the largest number of them came after, say, the civil rights movement and the desegregation of so many of our institutions in the city.
Would you say then that there was even greater change during the 1960s than there had been during the 1950s?
Yes, I think so. One thing, time just makes for a difference. You had more people who were graduating from the schools, and then the population was expanding, and there were more agencies being opened, giving women an opportunity to participate. And then women began to be a little pushy suddenly after the civil rights movement. They just began to be a little more pushy
Mm-hmm.
than they had before, because they had there was a more of a opportunity now for them to get into activities that they once were closed.
Mm-hmm. Closed because of segregation.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And then closed also because many of them were not did not have the proper amount of education too. I was told Mrs. Blackburn's daughter, and I don't think she was a college graduate. She wasn't, and there was several other women whom I knew were not college graduates, but they were very active in it. Oh yes, another institution that gave them some role opportunity was the Atlanta Housing Authority. Annie Ruth Hill became the first black woman to head the Grady Homes housing project. She was the manager of the Grady Homes housing project. Now that was even before the civil rights movement, when she was a member of head of the Atlanta housing project.
Mm-hmm. When you describe in the 1950s the beginning of this push for more and better recognition, would you say there was a lack of recognition prior to that time?
I would think so. Even yet, we suffer as women sometimes, and we still have to fight for, shall I say, a place in society. But then they had to even work harder to participate, because men oftentimes didn't want to recognize women. So many of them felt that women's place was in the home, and many women felt that.
Mm-hmm.
And times have just brought about this change, but I think women helped to bring about the change, this push for better recognition for themselves.
Do you see other influences that led into this push?
Perhaps there are other agencies. We have women participating now in more government positions now.
Mm-hmm.
This is not only true of black women, this is true of white women. I think we've got 5 women now who are running for Congress or some position and we've got women in other government positions, so that what has caused it is just the changing times, as well as I say, the women themselves are becoming more interested. And then there's that women's movement. What is the name of the women's movement? Gloria, the woman who was charged of this feminist group, in a number of women, 2 outstanding women's organizations that have developed and have given women encouragement to be
such as
strong.
the National Council of National Organization for Women.
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
there are two of those organizations. I don't remember them now. But anyway, we've got some strong, at least some strong women's groups now that champion the causes
Right.
of women.
When the contemporary women's movement, including women like Gloria Steinem and
That's who it
organizations,
is.
right, such as the National Organization for Women, when they came on the political scene here locally in Atlanta, do you recall what your response was to their program?
Yes, frankly, I've never thought very much about either one of the groups. Perhaps due to my busy state as a librarian, I never cared to participate. I had nothing particularly against them. I didn't understand them, some of their desires. I'm still not sure I understand what so many of them mean by feminism. But no, I never had any desire really to work with any of the groups, and either of those two groups especially, because I don't know, I felt kind of secure in my own rights. I felt that I could move along with the groups that I was already a member of. I didn't feel that they had much to offer me.
Mm-hmm.
And as I say, I don't know enough about them even yet. When I hear them mentioned now on TV, on the radio, I don't turn a deaf ear, but somehow I'm just really don't pay too much attention to them, because somehow I feel pretty secure in my own way, and I don't feel that I need to belong to a group
Mm-hmm.
such as they.
I'm wondering, we've covered quite a bit of ground here, but are there additional comments or new material that you'd like to include in this interview?
I would like to call attention to the two indexes which I have done during the early years when I came into the city. The Atlanta newspapers published very little or no material at all on the black community and activities and achievements of blacks in Atlanta and in Georgia. And basically most of the material that they published was on crime or some such story. And I knew that our community had more to offer to our readers than just stories of black crime. And as I read the black newspapers, we had 2 or 3 at that time: the Atlanta Daily World, the Atlanta Voice, and the Atlanta Inquirer. And as I saw what those papers were publishing that was happening in our community, and plus what I knew was happening, I felt that that material would be lost, and lost forever, if it was not put into preserved. And so I decided to do an index and on black Atlanta, which the newspapers, the white newspapers, had not covered. And I chose 4 areas to select materials, because I knew that I could not select material on all of the things that were published in the newspaper. So I collected articles in 4 areas: pioneer citizens, activities and contributions of pioneer citizens, sociological activities in the area of sociology, in the area of politics, and in the area of economics, and any history that, like historical institutions and what they were doing. That first volume covered the years 1950 through 1960, and it was entitled Negro Progress in Atlanta, Georgia, 1950 through 1960, a bibliography on race and human relations. And that volume became very popular. It was reviewed widely and became very popular. And then the next volume I did was volume 2. That covered the years 1961 through 1970. And that volume is still very popular, and I still cover the same amount of material. And it's interesting to see how much material and how we have grown, how our city has grown. For example, there are just pages of material that I collected on men like Mina Jackson, Martin Luther King, Dr. Yancey's, and pioneer citizens and their contributions to the city, and many other things that is outstanding in our community. I've collected this material because the average citizen does not have access to any material in the colleges and the universities. They would have to get special permission if they wanted something on our black community. They would have to get a permission to use the college or university library. And I was trying to preserve this material as well as make it available to our citizens, and it has proven to be rather a popular thing that I did, and I'm glad that I did it. I'm working on the third volume now, which will take up the years where the second volume leaves off, and go through the 80s. In other words, it will include 18 years of activities that I have collected from the newspapers. Now, I must say, too, that not only did I collect material from the Atlanta black newspapers, but also from the Atlanta Constitution and the Atlanta Journal, because these newspapers, after so long a time, they publish a goodly amount of material on the white newspapers publish a goodly amount of material on the black community. So the citizens use these books widely, and they are reference books, and they are mostly bought by the libraries. However, the number is limited. I only published, had printed 300 copies, and I think I've got about 50 left.
Anything else we should add to the record?
That's all I can think of now.